Okay, this is the second half of Teacher Tamer by Avi. This is starting at paragraph 80. Starts with Gregory left. Gregory left the candy store at a trot and went right to a gas station down the block. It sold cookies, chips, and soda. He went in and made a show of looking at the offerings. When no one was looking, he grabbed a book of complimentary matches from the counter and raced back to school. Complimentary means that they are free. Complimentary matches. Matches are, of course, matches that you light things on fire with. So he's got his matches, he's got his firecrackers, and now he's going back to school. At 4:30, Mrs. Wessex stepped out of the school. In each hand she had a cloth shopping bag loaded with books and papers. One bag bore the faded words, "If you can read this, thank a teacher." Gregory, crouched behind a parked car across the street, was waiting and watching for her. He found it easy to follow her. Not only was Mrs. Wessex a large woman, she was wearing a bright blue coat. Though Gregory knew, without knowing how he knew, that she lived in that neighborhood, he didn't know where. But then, he still didn't know his way around the area very well. Oh, he's new, remember? He just moved a couple months ago here, so he doesn't know his way around. In any case, she walked slowly. To Gregory, it appeared she had no interest other than the pavement before her. I'm curious, how do you think Mrs. Wessex feels at the end of her day? Wonder. When she went into a small grocery store, Gregory hid behind a garbage can. Emerging, which means coming out, she carried a paper bag stuffed with goods. Every now and then she paused and clumsily shifted her load. She was having trouble balancing all her belongings. Gregory, clutching his stink and smoke bombs in his pocket, followed at a safe distance. At one point he thought she might be turning to look. He quickly ducked behind some passing people. When the teacher continued on without looking back, so did Gregory. He was becoming excited. 1 block from the grocery store, Mrs. Wessex made a right turn onto Pearl Street, an old street bordered by large oak trees. The early spring leaves were bright green. Pearl Street ran through a dilapidated neighborhood of small wooden houses. Dilapidated means falling apart. So if you're in a dilapidated neighborhood, those small wooden houses are really old and kind of falling apart. Gregory had never been on this street before. Potholes marred the pavement. When something's marred, it means it's like marked up in a bad way. It's damaged a little bit. Many of the houses, if not quite in a state of decay, were in need of new paint and carpentry, or woodwork is carpentry. Porches sagged, paint peeled. Here and there a cracked window winked at the world. So does Mrs. Wessex live in a very rich, nice neighborhood? Or in a kind of a rundown, poor neighborhood? I think from all of this evidence here, we can say that she lives in a neighborhood that isn't very rich, isn't very new. After walking another 6 blocks, Mrs. Wessex turned onto a cement pathway that led to one of the single-story frame houses. It was in a row of similar houses. All had small porches. The house Mrs. Wessex entered was set back from the street by a small, sparse lawn and was covered with dull, white aluminum siding. Sparse means not very thick, so the lawn's really patchy. Not very nice lawn. 2 cracked cement steps led up to the front porch. Beyond the porch was a faded yellow door. So they're kind of painting this picture, right? Cracked steps, a faded door. Dull means not very bright, dull white siding. The lawn isn't very, very nice, so we're kind of seeing the picture of where Mrs. Wessex lives. Upon reaching the porch, Mrs. Wessex set down her 2 shopping bags, shifted the paper bag, and entered the house. In moments she returned, gathered up the shopping bags, then went back inside again. This time she shut the door firmly behind her. Gregory, standing behind a lamp-post, watched her intently. Only when Mrs. Wessex had gone in did he appraise the house. Appraise means judge the value. So now he's looking at her house. The building's run-down appearance was not what he had expected. He was not sure why, but he had assumed his teacher was rich. The apartment house he lived in was in better condition. So do you think Gregory's opinion is changing? I'm curious. And now that he'd actually arrived at Mrs. Wessex's house, Gregory began to feel uneasy. What if she had kids? What if there was a Mr. Wessex? What if he got caught? Worst of all, what if he did nothing and the kids at school got on his case? When you get on someone's case, that's an idiom. It means you give them a hard time. That's another idiom. It means you make fun of them, right? Instead of being a hero, he'd be more of a nerd than ever. He wished he'd not been so public about proclaiming his revenge, announcing his revenge. He remembered Ryan's taunt, Dory's promise. Taunt is that making fun of somebody or teasing them. It's not very nice. He squeezed the smoke and stink bombs in his pocket, then touched the book of matches. He had to go on. When it says book of matches, it's like those little paper things of matches. It's not like a book with a bunch of pages, but it's a little tiny thing like of matches that you open the cover of. So that's what it's called, a book of matches. Mrs. Wessex's house was no more than 5 feet from the homes to the right and left. Wow, so they're really crammed in there, aren't they? In the alleyway between her house and the one on the right was a jungle of bushes. As far as Gregory could tell, that side of the house had no windows. Then he saw what appeared to be a window low to the ground. Partly open, it was built into the building's foundation. That's like the cement the house is built on. Gregory guessed it led into the basement. Jungle of bushes is a great metaphor. After making sure no one was watching him, Gregory darted across the street and into the tangle of greenery. Once there, he threaded his way through the foliage to the low window and squatted down. Foliage means leaves. To his surprise, Mrs. Wessex's house was propped up by cement block pillars. Between the pillars was siding. Cement block pillars. Pillars are like columns. Between the pillars was siding. There was no basement. What he thought was a window was nothing more than a sheet of wood which covered a gap in the siding. So she doesn't have a basement or anything. Her house is even smaller than he originally thought. Gregory touched the board. It fell over with a loud thump. Fearful of discovery, he darted a look over his shoulder. No one was coming. Feeling safe again, he peered through the gaping hole into a crawl space. Next door, someone stepped out onto the porch, slamming the front door. Fearful of discovery, Gregory dove into the crawl space between Mrs. Wessex's house. So beneath means under. There he lay, face down on the dirt, breathing hard. His courage was evaporating. When no further sounds came from next door, Gregory lifted his head and looked about. It was gloomy there with a strong, clammy stench that almost made him throw up. Clammy means like that wet kind of gross basement dirt, nasty smell. Clammy is like a wet smell. Fumbling, Gregory drew out his pack of matches and lit one. The area from the ground to the house was no more than 3 feet in height. It was littered with junk. Bottles, cans, clumps of matted newspaper, an old mattress, even a broken bird cage. Overhead ran crisscrossing pipes and wires. So unlike Mrs. Wessex's desk. Interesting observation, right? It was so messy at home and so junky. There's stuff everywhere. But at school, Mrs. Wessex keeps her desk very, very neat. It's a very interesting thing for Gregory to notice. Even as Gregory looked about, he heard footsteps above his head. Automatically, he ducked. The match went out. Gregory listened intently, means carefully. He heard the sound of muffled voices, but who was speaking or what was being said, he couldn't tell. The footsteps retreated. The voices drifted away. He lifted his head. The more he looked around, the more perfect the crawl space seemed as a place to set off the bombs. All he had to do was find the right location so that stink and smoke would get into the house. His courage returned. He touched the bombs and grinned. Lit match in hand, he explored the area by crawling around. It took 3 more matches to discover something promising. A trap door. At least it was a square over his head with hinges on one side and a metal latch opposite. Gregory worked his way beneath the door, then lit another match and examined the latch. It was a metal shot bolt. He yanked at it. Not only did it pull free, the door dropped down, smacking him hard on his head. Gregory saw stars. That's an idiom. He didn't actually see stars, but it really knocked his head around. When he recovered, he looked about. 3 shoes had fallen to the ground. After pushing them aside, he crawled directly under the now open space. Another match allowed him to look up. At first, it seemed as if he were gazing up into a bundle of rags. The match went out. Gregory drew himself up on his knees, then slowly lifted his head until it was poking up through the opening. He was inside the house. The area was quite dark, save for one side where, along the floor, ran a strip of light. Gregory guessed he was seeing room light seeping under a door. That made him realize where he was. In a clothes closet. Better and better. Ooh, so his plan is even better, to set off a smoke bomb and a stink bomb inside a closet, right? He decided to take a chance and light one more match. The flame revealed clothing hung from wire and plastic hangers on two sides of the closet. Against another wall, all in a heap, lay shoes and slippers. On the fourth wall was a door. There was also a plastic basket heaped with rumpled clothing. High above was shelving holding a variety of boxes. In the ceiling was an unlit bulb. Hearing nothing, Gregory pulled himself up until he was standing in the dark closet. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the stinking smoke bombs. He made up his mind to light them, jerk the door open, heave the bombs in, then make his escape. He'd even be able to watch what happened from out front. He took out the matches. Suddenly, he heard a voice from beyond the closet. "Tell you how exhausted I am. I have to lie down." It was Mrs. Wessex. "You're always complaining," said another voice. To Gregory's ears it sounded like an older woman, but he couldn't be sure. "I'm not complaining," Mrs. Wessex said. Gregory's first impulse was to dive back down the hole and make his escape. His second impulse was to stay and listen. He was in his teacher's closet, listening to her private stuff. Irresistible, which means too tempting to resist. He leaned forward and put his ear to the door. "My dear," said the voice of the older woman, "I just wish you wouldn't come home from that school so tired every day." "Ma, it is exhausting, that's all. I just need to lie down." "Well, you could be thankful you have a good job. Lots of people don't have one." Suddenly the closet doorknob rattled. Panicked, Gregory flung himself to one side. The door opened. The closet seemed to explode with light. The blue dress Mrs. Wessex had worn that day came flying through the open door and fell in a heap on the floor. It was followed by a pink bra. The door slammed shut. Gregory looked at the clothes and nearly fainted. What was he doing there? He had done a terrible thing. He'd be arrested, put in jail. He lowered his feet into the trapdoor. "Ma," the voice continued from beyond. "Madge, try to remember they're just children. And do you get vacations? Ma, I've been teaching for 15 years. I have 36 kids in my class. I get lousy pay. Each year the kids get worse and worse, ruder and ruder. They don't want to learn. All they can talk about is sports, movies, and TV. They can't even sit still. They hate me. Sometimes I think you should have stayed married to Benny. You could have had your own kids." Oh, interesting. So Mrs. Wessex once had a guy named Benny, but I guess she's been divorced. "Do you know what happened today?" "Benny wasn't such a bad man, Madge. Yeah, he drank a little, but really not much. And when he was transferred—" "Ma, listen to me. Today I was sitting there reading. It was reading time. Someone shot a spitball right on my book." "A what?" "A spitball. That's dreadful," which means really bad. "Can't your principal do something?" "Ma, you don't understand." "Madge, I'm trying to understand." "You don't understand," cried Mrs. Wessex. "I knew who did it. Ryan Jurgensen, the class clown. But he thrives on being the center of attention. So instead I called up this boy, Gregory." Oh, so she knows Ryan did it, but she said Ryan thrives. He loves it. So if you thrive, you're growing really, really well. So he loves it being a center of attention. So she didn't call on him. So she called up Gregory instead. Interesting. Why him? Because Gregory is the smartest one in the class. It makes the other kids resent him, or they feel bitter toward him. They don't like him because he's smart. But I keep thinking if I pick on him enough, the other kids will accept him. Can you grasp that? Understand? I'm afraid that if the kids turn against him, he'll want to deny his intelligence. I want to keep him smart. That's what it comes to. I'm picking on him so he'll stay smart and amount to something. It's crazy. But you know what, Ma? At the same time, I resent Gregory because he's so young and could do so much, and I can't do anything anymore. What did he do when you blamed him? Gregory? He made fun of me. How? He dumped his money, coins, on the floor. Please, Madge, I wish you wouldn't cry. Ma, do you know what it is like to have a room full of kids who hate you, despise you, have no respect for you? I hate teaching. I used to be so good I can't stand it anymore. You've had a bad day, that's all. Or maybe you should think about getting another position. Sure, and if I can't get one, what are we supposed to live on? Your Social Security? That's money that you get when you're older and you're not working anymore. Go to sleep, honey. You're tired. You'll feel better when you're rested. There was silence. In the closet, Gregory, who had heard it all, pressed a hand to his heart to keep it from beating so wildly. He listened and thought he detected the sounds of someone outside the closet. Was it Mrs. Wessex on her bed? He kept listening. After a while, he began to hear snores. Mrs. Wessex's snores! He started to laugh, but the laugh faded. He thought of what he had heard, and all he could feel was a heaviness in his heart. Quietly, he lowered himself the rest of the way through the trap door. Once in the crawl space, he looked around for the shoes that had fallen down. He put them back into the closet with care, then shut the trap door and latched it. When he made his way out from under the house, he ran all the way home, dumping the firecrackers in a garbage can. The next morning, Gregory was waiting at the school before they let the early arrivals into the building. He was glad none of the kids from his class were there. As soon as the doors were unlocked, he raced down the hallway toward his classroom. He reached it. Mrs. Wessex was alone in the room. She was at her desk working on papers. Gregory edged into the room. He kind of snuck in. After a moment, Mrs. Wessex looked up. She began to smile, caught herself, and frowned. Oh, interesting. So she started to smile at Gregory, but then she was like, oh, nope, can't do that. She frowned. Yes, Gregory, she said rather severely, meaning very strict. The bell hasn't rung. What do you want? In spite of himself, Gregory blushed. His face went pink. It was about yesterday. Yes, said Mrs. Wessex. There was pain in her eyes. Gregory wanted to put his arms around her and give her a hug. Instead, he said, I just wanted to say, you're the best teacher in the whole world. A startled look came to Mrs. Wessex's face. She was surprised look. For a moment, Gregory thought she was going to cry. Why do you say that? She asked. I just think so. He looked down at his feet. Oh, she said very softly. Thank you. On the playground, his classmates gathered around. Did you get your revenge? Ryan taunted. He teased. Yeah, Gregory replied. Cool. What did you do? Never mind what. Just see the way she acts. Gregory was right. It was almost a month before Mrs. Wessex became angry again. But not before Ryan had given him a new name. Teacher Tamer. Okay, so that's the end of that story. Please take some time, if you're on this website, to look at the questions that were here and the assessment questions. They really help you understand exactly what was going on in the story, okay? And then we are going to do a little bit of writing questions about this story, and we'll see what you think, and maybe what you would have done if you were in Gregory's situation. Okay?